This is Catalina Uribe. Thank you for joining us. My name is Catalina Uribe. I'm a Program Officer for Conflict and Security at International IDEA. And I'd like to give a warm welcome to our panelists today. Ivan Briscoe, a former senior researcher at the Clingendael Institute's Conflict Research Unit, and currently at the International Crisis Group as Program Director for Latin America and the Caribbean in Bogota. Also with us, Alexander Kupatadze. I hope I'm pronouncing his last name correctly. He's an assistant professor at King College London, and also hopefully soon with us, because we're having some connection issues with her, Irma Méndez de Hoyos, who's a research professor at FLASCO, Mexico. This webinar is produced by International IDEA. We're an intergovernmental organization working to support democracy worldwide. We have 29 member states from around the world. And today's webinar will deal with the issue of how organized crime affects elections. This is part of a project entitled Protecting Politics, which International IDEA has been working on since 2009. Together with some partners, most recently with the Clingendael Institute and the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. This webinar deals with a report we just published with the Clingendael Institute, and is part of a broader series of 4 reports that deal with how organized crime affects elections, but also political parties, service delivery, and local democracy. Just to remind you that for those of you who are tweeting, please use the hashtag #ProtectingPolitics. And also to join us for the last webinar we will have next week on Tuesday at the same time. It's going to deal with organized crime and political parties, and we will have Diana Goff, James Cocaine, and Sheikh Medibo Diarra. Also, for those of you in Stockholm, you can join us in our launch in Stockholm at the International IDEA's headquarters on 29 November. And you can find all this information, including the links to the reports and the webinars, etc., on our website. And just to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be soon available online, as well as the other webinars that we've been producing. Before we start, I would like to just run a brief poll of where you are and where what your background is. Okay, we will do the poll later because I think I just deleted polls, so that's not good. But we can do that in the end. So I'll just go ahead and just share with you what the agenda is for today. We will have Ivan Briscoe first talking about, well, this report, how organized crime affects elections, and the research we conducted in some countries with case studies. Also, afterwards, we will have Alexander Kupatadze talking about organized crime role in politics in Eastern Europe. And finally, Irma Méndez sharing some insights on Mexico and how their organized crime affects elections. We will finalize with some Q&A from the participants. You're welcome to post your questions throughout the event. On the right-hand side of your screen, you will have the question tab. So yeah, just like welcome, Ivan, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say about this issue. We can't hear you. Just a second.
Can you hear me? Is that okay? Good. Well, thank you very much, Catalina. Thank you to everybody out there who I don't see at the moment, but it's a pleasure to be here. I'm speaking from our Crisis Group office in Bogota, but I was deeply involved in preparing this report. I was the lead author of this report while working at the Clingendael Institute in the Netherlands. And what I'm going to do is briefly talk about the main issues which we dealt with in the report, mention some of the case studies that we carried out, and if time permits, come to some of the main conclusions we reached. Please bear in mind, as Catalina mentioned earlier, this report is one of a series of 4, in which I myself and my colleague Diana Goff were involved in 2 of them. The other one was on political parties. And many issues are obviously shared between all four papers, looking at the different ways organized crime intersects with democratic processes. We carried out case study work in Mali, Mexico, and Georgia. And so many of our most interesting, our richest findings can be come from those places. But before I get to that, I would like to situate the nature of this research, because we are using terms, especially the term organized crime, which tend to be easily confused with other notions such as corruption networks or other forms of crime, which are not, strictly speaking, organized. So, so what do we mean? What exactly are we talking about, and why is it important now? Well, I think the first issue is that there are a number of challenges which electoral democracy is facing worldwide, which are relevant to organized criminal interest in democratic procedures and to elections in particular. And the second issue when it comes to situating our research is identifying the precise relationship between different forms of electoral fraud, which are well established and which need not be carried out by organized crime, can be carried out by state officials, security officers, small-scale criminals, corrupt politicians, not necessarily organized criminals, but trying to disentangle the relationship between those forms of electoral fraud and organized criminal influence over elections. Both of these are complex issues. We are dealing with much broader scale phenomena, i.e. challenges to elections worldwide and the emerging nature of electoral crime, and trying to, on the basis of those, find the precise relationship between organized crime, for-profit activity such as drug trafficking, human trafficking, extortion networks, kidnapping networks, a whole series of different organized criminal practices, and elections. And so that's a little bit the basis of how we went about, looking at this issue. And I'll try and clarify the points I've just raised now. What are those global challenges to electoral democracy that we are talking about? And I think two emerge without doubt in any review of recent elections worldwide. One is the extremely high cost of competitive elections. Estimates from Brazil in 2014, India recently, the United States at the moment, a whole host of European elections or elections in new democracies. One example we found was that of Somaliland, which had a cost of, in its recent local elections, equivalent to around about half its GDP. So we see this as a phenomenon, a secular phenomenon affecting democracies worldwide. At the same time, we see evidence of increasing high polarization, which gives rise in certain extreme cases to very contentious or contested elections. We all know of these elections in places such as Zimbabwe, Thailand, Kenya, a whole series of relatively well-known cases. Perhaps the most recent case, which is most striking, is that of Libya in 2014, where the election results basically gave rise to a division between two governments, which has not yet really been entirely resolved. In both cases, as we will see, the high cost of elections and high polarization in elections, which can lead to disputed polls, is fertile ground for organized criminal involvement. It's also fertile ground for other criminal phenomena, but particularly organized criminal involvement. And the second issue which I raised earlier is the distinction between different sorts of electoral crime and fraud, and the particular case of organized criminal involvement in electoral processes. Now, we know that there are certain polities, political circumscriptions, so that's a Spanish word, right? Political constituencies, in which the tradition, there has been a tradition of high levels of organized criminal involvement in the electoral process on election day, in determining which candidates get elected and which not. I mean, these are well studied, well known, and are undeniable cases. There are three in particular: southern Italy and Sicily, where the mafia involvement in elections has been tracked over the course of decades. Jamaica, in the Caribbean, where we know quite a lot about the power of so-called criminal dons in controlling the voting patterns of what are called garrison communities, or communities under the control of well-established criminal networks, which ally with certain politicians in a sort of transactional fashion at election time. And of course, Colombia, which has a well-established tradition of criminal involvement in elections, which has also been extremely well studied. But these are relatively select, exceptional cases. They are well studied, but they do not seem to give rise to general theories which we can apply to all elections in all different polities worldwide. What we do know is numerous types of electoral fraud which exist and which can be spotted in any number of recent elections. Obviously, probably the most notorious of them were the Afghan elections in 2009 and 2014, which were affected by what one losing candidate called electoral fraud on an industrial scale. But this is not the only case. There are definitely other cases. However, the fraud carried out in which might be ballot stuffing, other forms of rigged elections, miscounting of votes, and other forms of fraud are not necessarily the work of organized crime as I defined it earlier. They can be carried out, as I mentioned, by corrupt politicians, state officials, security officers. So what we need to know, what we try to establish in our research, is what are the conditions for organized criminal involvement in electoral processes, and what are the strategies? Why would organized criminals want to be involved in elections anyway? And these are very valid issues, and they're not particularly difficult to they are difficult to answer in certain cases, not so much perhaps in others. As I said, we have different forms of electoral fraud. Some of them seem to be more characteristic of authoritarian states, of corrupt political networks. We can think of election systems which are rigged by law, which favor in the design of constituency or the design of the voting system particular political interests. But this doesn't necessarily seem to be the work of organized crime, or maybe only on the margins. However, there are two sorts of electoral crime which are more closely related to organized criminal activity. One is election violence, election-related violence. We saw in the case of Kenya, after its disputed election of 2007, that there was evidence of organized criminal groups involved in some of the violence, which claimed the lives of around 1,000 people after that election. And also, obviously, in the case of campaign finance. I mentioned the issue of electoral finance earlier. It's a complex one. It involves large flows of money, much of which comes from legitimate businesses or private individuals who seek to gain a foothold in future political decisions or decisions in favor of their own businesses, using legitimate, licit finance for illicit or illegitimate purposes. But there are also cases in which organized criminal groups themselves use criminal resources for illicit campaign finance. It's not easy to distinguish between the two, but there are a number of cases. Obviously, the bigger the flows of campaign finance, the less control there are of these flows, then the more likely it is in some ways that organized crime will also seek to push its own agenda by financing particular candidates, particular parties. However, this is where I would like to place a number of caveats on research to say that maybe the relationship between organized crime and elections is not as simple as might first appear. As I said earlier, not all of these crimes are carried out by organized crime. We also have to distinguish between state corruption, corruption carried out by politicians using their state powers to favor themselves and their allies through procurement, abuse of procurement, kickbacks in state contracts, state licenses, cheap credits from state-run banks, any number of abuses which state officials can be involved in from we must distinguish this sort of state corruption from for-profit organized crime. They're not necessarily the same. Those politicians who engage in corrupt rackets may have nothing to do with for-profit criminal activities such as drug trafficking, human trafficking, or extortion. They're in fact separate phenomena. And lastly, organized crime might not necessarily be interested in elections. Yes, it could be interested in controlling decisions by state officials, but why doesn't it just use corruption and coercion, i.e. threats of violence, against whoever is in office? Why does it matter that it has its own selected people in office when once they're elected or in place, or that it just seeks other means to influence whichever incumbent is there? And here there's a quote which I think is very relevant by the prosecutor, the famous prosecutor of Sicilian mafia, Giovanni Falcone, who was assassinated over 20 years ago, who said as follows: "The mafia doesn't enjoy getting involved in politics. Political matters are of little interest unless it feels its power or means of income have been directly threatened." So this portrait is of the criminal activity, which is largely oriented towards, establishing free space for trafficking, for illicit activities, without necessarily wishing to influence a political sphere until those politicians seek to impede their activities. Now, these are all caveats which can be seen playing out very clearly in individual case studies. But at the same time, I would suggest that we do see a strong tendency towards greater organized criminal involvement in certain polities in relation to corrupt activity in their states. Organized criminal activity seems to be expanding worldwide. Evidence for this is not always easy to find, but it seems to be expanding as trafficking routes become more profitable, various different forms of profitable trafficking routes. But states with high levels of corruption and the partisan use of state resources, so the sort of states which we might see in parts of particularly Latin America, Africa, and Asia, in which their corruption rackets are notorious in the state and well established. These states where there is a corrupt and partisan use of state resources tend to be fertile ground for deeper criminal involvement in elections. Why? Because elections are the crucial moments in which the future allocation of power in the corrupt state is decided. So that the stakes are so high in certain elections, the money flows are so significant that the conditions in which organized criminal engagement in elections and ties between organized crime and corrupt politicians through flows of money, through the use of violence, or through what we might call joint criminal governance, alliances between criminal rackets and corrupt politicians. This seems to be a phenomenon which is on the rise. It's what you might call the symbiosis between corrupt governance and criminalized political activity, in which organized criminal groups provide money, violence, and other forms of resources on behalf of politicians who will then use their powers once in office to return the money to those criminal groups and to their own allies. This model can be seen in various ways, shapes, or forms. And very briefly, if Catalina allows me, just going to discuss some of the findings, most relevant findings, from two of the case studies which we dealt with, Mali and Mexico, because I think we can see exactly these rather abstract phenomena taking place, instantiated, if you like, in these two examples. Mali, as many of you will be aware, was a supposedly model democracy which had a democratic transition in the early 1990s, then suffering 20 years later a serious crisis of legitimacy with an insurgent war, a jihadist takeover in the north of the country, and a coup d'etat in the capital. It's had a systematic problem with elections in that the elections have taken place at fairly regular intervals, but they have been affected by very low turnout. Turnout has hovered between 20 and 40% in almost all national elections since 1992. This makes the use of finance by candidates particularly important in winning, in securing power, because other forms of mobilization, ideological mobilization, class-based mobilization, other forms of sector-based mobilization are so extremely weak. So in their place of those other forms of mobilization, candidates have turned to money-based mobilization. And then once in political office, this being a very poor, unfortunately a very poor country, have used their powers over state resources to return the investments made by their financial backers. So there are a whole series of transactions and quid pro quos which can be seen across the entire breadth of the Malian political system. One former minister who I interviewed during my research there put it very neatly. He said, democracy does not ask leaders to be accountable for their records, and democracy does not allow the best leaders to be chosen. There is a systemic problem with multi-party democracy in Mali at the moment, very low levels of credibility and numerous challenges to the system, whether by Islamists or by criminal actors. There are just a couple of extra elements I'd throw in the case of Mali. This is the systemic background of a transactional political system is one which has given rise to a couple of slightly disturbing particular phenomena. One is the partisan enforcement of electoral rules, largely through the Supreme Electoral Tribunal in Mali, which is the constitutional court, which is dominated by executive-appointed judges, and which does not seem to be, in the eyes of the opposition or the EU monitoring team of 2013, the monitoring team for the presidential elections then, a particularly impartial body for arbitrating electoral disputes. And the other phenomenon is, of course, the criminal groups operating in the north of the country, often in tandem with other armed groups, some of them Islamists, some of them not, in a highly fragmented, heavily armed and unstable environment. The role of these criminal groups, many of them involved in different trafficking and kidnapping rackets, is relatively well known and well studied, and has caused a significant problem in that local elections have not been held since 2009 due to the risk of insecurity on the ground, as different criminal groups ally with different political, tribal, ethnic factions, causing a great risk in the north of the country of violence and instability as election day approaches. And so local elections have simply not been held for the last 7 years. And the risk may be intensified by the fact that the peace deal reached last year in Mali to solve the violence in the north has included a promise of greater devolution of powers to the north through the election of regional presidents. The problem is here, this might be an entryway into further abuses of power by criminal networks, as they see a greater opportunity to gain a foothold in formal state institutions, which are still obviously very weak and will be created if the peace accord is implemented in coming years. I know my time is coming to an end, so I'm not really going to go into great detail on the question of Mexico. I believe that Irma will be talking about that in a short while. I would just point out in the case of Mexico, which is a fascinating study, where there are high levels of violence against local mayors and local political candidates, but very low levels of violence when presidential elections are held, which is an interesting case of how the most powerful institutions of the Mexican state do not suffer in the electoral processes very notable examples of organized criminal involvement, whereas the lower levels of power do, because for organized crime, it's obviously most important to control trafficking routes and therefore to control the political authorities on those trafficking routes, which are run by different parties and run by obviously a whole number of different candidates. Their priority is controlling those routes. Central power, in which there are a very large number of resources in elections being committed by businesses, by the state, and by lots of other interests. Control of central power is probably not not within their strategic realm of interest. They would like cooperative central powers, but it's not something they will be able to achieve through the injection of resources at election time. Generally, what we see in organized criminal involvement in elections in Mexico is a very selective use of corruption and coercion to achieve their goal of basically the permissiveness of local authorities for their criminal activity. But they will use that corruption and coercion against whoever is in power or looking like they will gain power. As one former politician told me, in the case of Mexico, organized crime is not a machine in Mexico for generating narco-politicians. Organized crime has its own separate arrangements with power, arrangements which are based on a constant presence and a constant threat of violence in affected areas, including killings of mayors, which are unfortunately one of the most chronic crimes, political crimes in Mexico, as we've seen in recent years. Just very briefly, I'd like to come up to a few of our most significant conclusions on the basis of this research. Electoral processes, as we have seen in almost all the cases which we looked at in depth, as well as many others, are not necessarily the main targets for criminal organizations seeking political influence. There are lots of other ways for criminal organizations to gain a foothold in power, which can involve regular interchanges of different sorts with the politicians in power and with state officials and with security officers. But in contexts affected by large cash flows at election time, high levels of polarization, chronic violence at election time, and a general corruption of political life, then organized crime does have a number of portals for influence which it will use and which it will be invited to use by different corrupt actors in the state for their own competitive advantage. It's this proximity between organized crime and established corruption networks which I think is the most important threat which organized crime can pose when it comes to manipulating or electoral processes. The proposals we come up with at the end of this report are quite general, but can be applied to different contexts, based obviously first and foremost in more sophisticated investigations, cross-cutting investigations as to criminal involvement in political life, in which the different streams of campaign finance are distinguished, and also we propose different new novel forms of oversight of political activity and electoral activity, particularly in new political arenas of the sort which we studied in northern Mali. I'll leave it there. I'd be happy to go into more depth on any of those particular issues and our recommendations, but I think my time is up. So thank you very much, and I'll hand over to Catalina.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating, and I look forward also to the Q&A to perhaps dig a bit deeper into some of those particular issues you mentioned. But I'll hand over to Alexander. Just bear in mind to keep attention to the time, but we are eager to listen to what you have to say. Thanks.
So can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Is my screen, did it come up, the presentation, or no? No. There must be a way to share my screen. Yes. All right, great. So, well, thanks for having me. I'm in Georgia now, actually. We just had elections a week ago, and ruling Georgian Dream has won again. And the main opponents of the Georgian Dream was a political opposition party, United National Movements, And perhaps this was an example of the elections when there was very limited role of more underworld type of political criminal groups, because these two conflicting parties, they could afford funding the elections. One is funded by a billionaire businessman, and another one is funded by some of the representatives of the previous elites who miraculously got rich after the 9 years of rule of United National Movement. Anyway, I was asked to talk about organized crime and its interaction with politics in the case of Georgia. So that's what I'm going to do, and I will focus mainly on the underworld actors, poorly criminal groups, so-called thieves in law, traditional organized crime, equivalents of Sicilian mafia godfathers or Jamaican dons that Ivan has been talking about. And I will also give some contextual comparisons with other Eastern European and former Soviet Union cases while I will do this. So there's a particular trajectory of development of organized crime in Georgia and the way it interacted with the politics. And that's mainly because Georgia contributed unproportionally to Soviet and post-Soviet underworld. So more than 30% of the thieves in law, Zakoni in Russian, they were of Georgian origin, and at the same time, Georgians were only 2% of the overall population of the Soviet Union. Georgia contributed a lot, and that also means that there was also impacts of this type of traditional organized crime back home. So unlike other parts of former Soviet Union, traditional organized crime penetrated politics from the very beginning. In other parts of Soviet Union, organized crime first established itself as a monopolizer of racketeering markets, extortion markets, and then it penetrated politics and established links with the politicians. In Central Asia and in Ukraine, other places, there was lots of interaction between sportsmen and organized crime. Many of the sportsmen that have been left redundant after the breakup of the Soviet Union, left without the source of legitimate income, they joined organized criminal networks. But in Georgia, there was the abundance of these traditional organized crime actors, thieves in law, and many of them have become very important political figures already in the early 90s. And one of them is Jaba Ioseliani, this guy, who was the leader of a paramilitary group, Hedrioni, and was also second in terms of power and influence in Georgia in the early 90s. So in the 90s and early 2000s, thieves have influenced political decision-making on central and local levels. They have established extensive links with different law enforcement structures. Many of the MPs elected in the national legislature have been on the payroll of organized crime, or they have been members of organized criminal groups. So you have this complete criminalization of the politics in the late 90s and early 2000s. But things change after the Rose Revolution of 2003. There is a real breaking point. That's when most of the old guard has left the power. There's a team of very young, Western-educated individuals headed by Mikhail Saakashvili, who is the governor of Odessa in Ukraine now, who came to power, and Saakashvili had this idea of building a strong state, and his project of a strong state did not tolerate alternative sources of authority, such as thieves in law. So there was a major anti-organized crime crackdown after the Rose Revolution. The impact of the thieves have been curbed dramatically. Their property has been confiscated. For example, you see on the left is a picture of a mansion formerly owned by Shakro Kalashov, one of the leaders of the Moscow underworld, and became the office of Financial Intelligence Service of Georgia after it was confiscated. On the right is another mansion owned by another thief-in-law, who became the office of the police after it was confiscated by the authorities. So political and economic power of the thieves-in-law has been curbed, but they still played a limited role, especially in controlling prisons. And this is important because Soviet and post-Soviet organized crime is different from Mexican or African or Chinese organized crime, because Soviet organized crime was born in the prisons. The birthplace, the Soviet gulags. And there's this very strong connection between Soviet and post-Soviet underworld and penal institutions. So because of that, thieves still play a very important role in prison governance, and sometimes it's almost a strategic necessity for the authorities to enlist these thieves so that they are able to establish some kind of control over the prison population. It's different how then these thieves translate that kind of influence on the prisons into the political benefits, but that's another issue. So we have this decline of thieves after the Rose Revolution, but there's still lots of different types of connections between the different types of politicians and the leaders of organized crime. Much of these connections is very difficult to quantify, but these allegations are often used in political battles and to damage the reputation of the political enemies. For example, the political opposition has been talking for a long time about Kupatadze, the acting vice prime minister, who allegedly helped thieves to use Georgia as a transit territory. There's a law according to which any thief that enters Georgia has to go to prison for 7 years. But allegedly, there were thieves coming into Georgia, but then under protection of law enforcement, they have been moving through Georgia to a third country. There's some evidence, but it's not conclusive, so it's very difficult to quantify. But in response, then the government released the data that thieves have been traveling to Georgia even before the previous government. It's often used as a compromising material in this process of political competition. But more importantly, these allegations often does not matter much to the voters because, I mean, it's very difficult to make normative judgments, maybe because the voters think that these kind of connections are fine because they've seen these kind of relationships for a long time, or maybe they don't care as far as the politicians deliver public goods, or maybe there's too much mudslinging going on, so there's some kind of real accountability problem. Voters cannot really determine whether the allegation is true or not. But the point is that there's some inconclusive evidence, and this nexus between politicians and criminals is often used in political competition games. And this is Kupatadze, the acting vice prime minister, and there was lots of allegations against him and his connections with thieves-in-law. This is one of the criminal authorities who transited through Georgian territory a few years ago, and allegedly Kupatadze has been protecting this criminal authority. And in the picture you can see a very famous Russian criminal together with Kupatadze and Shevchenko, a Ukrainian soccer player. So there's some evidence that criminally affiliated individuals, they're still used by different political parties during the elections. Many of these criminals, they are still very popular in the local neighborhoods because of a number of reasons. They have been acting as local Robin Hoods for a long time, or because they have helped their neighborhoods, or because they're just cool and they are kind of role models locally. I mean, there could be many different reasons, but the point is that There's some allegations, especially by the non-governmental organizations, that many of these criminals are leaving the prisons just before the elections, and then they are seen to play an active part in the political campaigns of different parties. The role of traditional organized crime in politics is, again, very difficult to quantify, but one can argue that it's not important in contemporary Georgia. The traditional organized criminals, such as illicit law, doesn't have as much impact on the political process as they had before. And the impact of organized crime has been somehow limited, but there's no mental revolution, which means the attitudes of the population toward the rule breaking of the law did not change much. And the popularity of some of the criminals in the local neighborhoods is a kind of indirect proof for that. It also means that if a state gets weaker and if state coercive capacity diminishes, then there's some chance for these organized criminal bosses to come back and influence politics as they did before. So I was very conscious about the time, and I will leave it there. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. That was, very interesting and an example that really contrasts with those Ivan mentioned about Georgia and Mali, Mexico and Mali. So very interesting to see the differences and how these developments took place. We will now go to Irma, and also to be very conscious of time, Irma, but yeah, the floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes? Okay. Well, I want to thank Catalina and Elena for participating in this seminar. I'm very happy to be with you. Well, I want to make 3 points. And the first one is has to do with the present knowledge. From the report, we have seen that we know very little about the interaction between the organized crime and elections, and we know very little because, as the report mentions, there is a very close link between the political corruption in general, and organized crime. And it's very difficult to disentangle where the organized crime is acting and where is simply, the corruption going on. So I think it's we know very little, and we recognize that the problem is there, but we really don't know. We haven't been able to explain and to understand when and why the criminals and the organized crime is acting in elections. There is one particular idea in the report that I want to discuss, and it has to do with the link between the organized crime and these sort of activities as electoral fraud and vote buying. And I mention this because my starting point is that elections are a very costly process. Organizing elections and run a campaign is not an easy activity, and I would like to mention that, from my point of view, it's difficult to understand why the organized crime are involved in elections as their first choice. I would say that as elections are very difficult to organize, and even vote buying, the evidence that we have, the research we have done, shows that the effective vote buying and the effective electoral fraud needs a long-term relationship, especially vote buying. So it is not things that you organize, you know, every election. You all even need, you know, this kind of social links between people and candidates and parties. So I mean, my first question when I was reading the report said, well, I mean, I thought, why do you need election fraud if you don't have a candidate? So in a sense, what I'm trying to make in this point is that I think that the intervention of organized crime in elections is the last option they have, and we should think about, you know, the other conditions that make them this option a necessity. Why they, in a sense, came to vote buying, election fraud, and in general to have candidates and intervening campaigns in certain municipalities and certain regions and certain states and not in others. So this is, you know, my idea about this general, the present knowledge about organized crime and their action or intervention in elections. My second point has to do with the lack of approaches and tools and methodological tools to create indicators, to catch, to understand, to make a good diagnosis of the intervention of organized crime in elections. I think we have, you know, like two bodies, and it is also mentioned in a sense in the report. We have, you know, literature about elections and electoral behavior. We also have, you know, a strong body of research and literature about criminal activity, security policies and all this, but we don't have so far something, you know, good, strong enough to produce, you know, good hypothesis in terms of how and when and why the criminal organizations interfere in elections. So I think this is something we have to work on. And my last point is about Mexico. And well, I mean, there is in the report an idea that has been mentioned several times, but I think, I mean, the logic and the evidence is so far still poor in terms of the relationship between the war against the organized crime and the rising trend of criminal activity in elections. I think, I mean, there is no clear evidence that shows that effectively, I mean, the result of the war against the organized crime launched by the President Felipe Calderón was the result, was the cause of the increasing activity of the organized crime and the fragmentation of the criminal organizations. And what we have found in the Electoral Integrity Project, well, I mean, you know that I'm coordinating, well, I don't know if you know, but I'm coordinating the application of the survey about the electoral integrity, the perception survey at local level, at the state level. And we have now, I mean, we did the first survey in 2015 and the second one in 2016. And I did also an expert survey in 2012. So we, different from the Integrity Project, but we have now a piece of evidence that shows us that the organized crime moved from financing candidates to select candidates. So they are right now within parties acting directly in the selection of candidates. And well, this is very obviously very dangerous, and in a sense what we have at the research we have done shows that there is a kind of movement and transition in the way the organized crime has intervened, and they have moved from negotiations with the government, with the official governments, with public servants, to obviously extortion, intimidation, and then to intervene in elections primarily some years ago, basically funding campaigns and candidates. But as elections have become very competitive, they can win, but they can also lose. And now they decide to select, to get into the selection of candidates within not only one party, but to have candidates in all parties. So apparently the organized crime and different groups have candidates within all political parties. They finance their campaigns, but obviously, as the report mentions, this is not a general strategy. It is a selective one, and we have to try to explain, because we haven't done so far, why are some states and municipalities and regions more vulnerable to others. What we know is that at least in Mexico, the rural areas are no far. They are not now the best, let's say, candidates for the criminal intervention, but the urban and wealthy municipalities. So something that we have concluded is that the organized crime strategies are moving, are changing, and are changing very fast. And they have a very close relationship with parties. So I think there are, this is my final comment, we have now two very dangerous and difficult areas to work with to understand the criminal, the organized crime intervening in elections. On the one hand, political parties and the way in which they are not, in a sense, accepting the intervention of the organized crime in the selection process of their candidates, but apparently, it is the case, and there is some evidence, as you know. And on the other hand, we have a very fragile government at local and state level with no professional civil service whatsoever. So if you see, at the end of the day, what the organized crime is trying to control is the decision-making process. And the weakest part of the democratization process in Mexico is evidently the political parties. They have not, transited from being an institutions open, to many different influences, to a very to a more institutionalized organization with rules and in a sense being able to enforce that rules. And obviously we have this fragmentation within the government that it's very dangerous. So this is my final point. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Irma, and we are very glad that in the end we were able to get hold of you. Irma is joining from Guerrero in Mexico, so the connection was lost at the beginning, but fortunately we were able to get her back. We have exactly 3 minutes, so we have a couple of questions, but I'll just let Ivan perhaps respond to some of the ideas raised by both Alexander and Irma. I thought it was very interesting from Alexander how the process has led to this decreased impact of organized crime in political processes in general and elections in particular, but that not really reflecting into public perceptions as such. But also the issues raised by Irma concerning the increased interest in selecting candidates more than really financing them. And I will let you only speak for 1 minute. If you go beyond that, I'll break.
Thank you very much, Katerina. I'll be very brief. Thank you very much to both Alexander and Irma. I thought that was fascinating. Alexander, absolutely. That was, I mean, the Georgian case is a very illustrative, very strong case of how concerted political action can sever the links between crime and politics. However, what we found in our research was that the risk that strong institutions of control over political life and electoral campaigning can then be used by different political forces to hit the opposition. So what you do need is a sort of, how do you, if you have stronger controls over politics, how do you have more independent mechanisms of control? That's a sort of situation which Georgia is in at the moment, which would almost be regarded as a privileged position for a lot of other countries who are nowhere near that goal. But that remains the case in Georgia. Irma, thank you very much. There's a wealth of ideas in what you've mentioned. On the question of the candidate selection process, yes, I mean, I have gathered certain anecdotal evidence on this. I would imagine it's extremely difficult to establish with any certainty. But if that is the case, and that you can really open this box, which you're absolutely right, this black box, the political party management, then I think you might get through to some of the key mechanisms of criminal control of political life in Mexico. And I very much welcome the comments you made. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So with that, it's exactly 5. So I'll conclude this webinar. So thank you, Ivan, thank you, Alexander, and thank you, Irma, and thank you all of you for joining. This recording will be available in about a week's time or even sooner. Thank you to Helena Schwertheim, or yeah, I can't pronounce her last name, but thank you very much for organizing this. I know she was sweating here trying to get everybody on hold, but yeah, we're very happy that you were able to join us. And remember to join us next week for the last webinar in this series. Thank you.